Welcome back, Highlanders, to the 10th and final discussion for our Econ 2 Introduction to Macroeconomics class. Here in week 10, we're going to be kind of doing a quick summary of the last four chapters on fiscal and monetary policy and how they relate to economic stability. So once again, I usually try to do these discussion sections on the material that I think is kind of hardest for students to understand from the particular chapter that we go over that week. But in this chapter, I don't think there's anything that's too complicated or needs a lot of extra attention. So I figured I'd use this discussion section to kind of summarize monetary and fiscal policy and how it relates to economic stability, and talk a little bit about historical and future contexts with which this policy has been applied or is currently being applied. So with that in mind, right, remember, if the economy is out of recession, there's a couple different ways we can do to help lift the economy up. And if you're a Keynesian economist, you think that one of the things that we should use is this expansionary fiscal policy. All right, that's going to help stimulate aggregate demand because we're going to increase government spending and or cut taxes, right? So that should make the G go up in that Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX equation. And the fact that we've cut taxes will help people have more money to spend. So if we increase consumption and government spending, then that should boost aggregate demand. Right? That's the idea behind expansionary fiscal policy, and that's what we talked about in Chapter 11. And then in Chapter 12, though, we talked about some possible side effects of that expansionary fiscal policy, one of which is that idea of crowding out, or the idea that the government's going to need to borrow more money in order to finance this increase in spending while cutting taxes at the same time. And that increased government borrowing is going to cause the demand for loanable funds to go up, which is going to increase interest rates and crowd out private spending, right? So if the economy is stimulated, or if aggregate demand does increase, it won't increase by as much as we thought. And then you have the idea of the Ricardian equivalence, which suggests that the government gives people stimulus checks. People are going to be likely to put those stimulus checks right into a savings account rather than spend it, because they know that those higher future taxes are coming if the government is cutting our taxes and spending more now. Right? We're smart enough to know that that's going to lead to increases in budget deficits, which means the government's going to have to make up that money later on. So again, people will be saving rather than spending this money, and the economy won't be lifted. Right? So the combination of these two ideas means that this policy is going to be less potent than we originally thought it would be, and that is something that both Keynesian and classical economists do agree on. Again, what makes a Keynesian economist Keynesian is that they think even though it's less potent, we should still do it and maybe do more of it as a result of it being less potent than we thought. Whereas classicals say, because it's less potent than we thought, we might want to think of a different solution entirely. Right? Another possible side effect is that this does increase the size of the budget deficit, which, if overused, can lead to a massive amount of debt. And as we've talked about, this expansionary fiscal policy does tend to be overused because it is more politically popular than using restrictive fiscal policy, which is designed to calm ourselves down from expansions, at the same time create the budget surpluses that we should be using to pay for those budget deficits. Of course, we run the expansionary fiscal policy more often than we run the restrictive fiscal policy, and that's what's led to a massive amount of debt, currently over $25 trillion in debt is what this nation is. Right? And finally, if timed incorrectly, it could lead to inflationary booms and less economic stability. Remember, this expansionary fiscal policy has got to be timed right. It's got to be timed while we're in a recession to help lift the economy out of a recession. Due to those timing lags that we've talked about, both in Chapter 11 as well as in the most recent Chapter 14, that is the recognition lag, the administrative lag, and the impact lag, this policy might not actually take hold until the economy is back to full employment, in which case we're going to create an economic bubble, right, that could be associated with some inflation. So again, we're not increasing economic stability, we are reducing it. Right. Now, if you don't like the fiscal policy idea, then the Federal Reserve can use expansionary monetary policy to stimulate aggregate demand, and this will increase money supply. And again, they can do this through four different ways. We talked about the four ways that the Fed conducts monetary policy back in Chapter 13. Right. They can either buy bonds, right? They can lower the discount rate. By lowering the discount rate, that means that they're going to lower the interest rate they're charging commercial banks. So commercial banks will borrow more money from the Fed, which will give them more money to loan out. They can also lower the reserve requirements or make sure that banks have to hold on to less money, which will allow them to lend out more. And they can pay less interest on excess reserves deposited at the Fed, which will encourage banks to keep less money at the Fed and loan out more dollars. So those are the four ways that the Fed can conduct this expansionary monetary policy to increase aggregate demand by increasing the money supply. Now, there are some side effects to this as well, as we talked about in Chapter 14. Right, one is that this expansionary monetary policy will only lead to inflation in the long run, so while it might create a short-run increase in employment or reduction in unemployment, and a short-run increase in real output, in the long run, all it's really going to lead to is inflation. So we got to really be worried about keeping that inflation in check for all the problems that we talked about that inflation causing back in Chapter 8. And then another side effect here is, again, it's got to be timed correctly. You got to use this expansionary monetary policy when we are in a recession to bring us back to full employment. If you don't time it correctly, then unfortunately you're going to create an inflationary boom, which is going to lead to less economic stability. Right, so here's a business cycle graph that we talked about back in Chapter 8. So again, just the main idea of what we're trying to do with this expansionary policy is we're trying to stimulate the economy to bring it back towards full employment. Right, so again, we can either use this expansionary fiscal policy to do that. And by using that expansionary fiscal policy, again, we're going to increase government spending and or cut taxes. And the idea is that's going to help stimulate the economy. Or we can use expansionary monetary policy. And again, that is just increasing our supply of money. So S subscript M, right, is just our abbreviation here for the supply of money. And so again, what we want to try to do is stimulate the economy out of that contraction and get us back to full employment. But in order to do it right for both these policies, you do have to time them correctly, right? And again, each policy has other side effects associated with it. Now, with that in mind, the other side of the coin is that we can try to use restrictive monetary policy to calm an economy down from an expansion, or restrictive fiscal policy if we prefer. So if the economy is in expansion, what can we do to calm it down? Because remember, those expansions can lead to inflation, as well as the bigger the boom, usually the bigger the bust that follows. So we don't want that expansion to get out of control either. So the government can use restrictive policy to reduce aggregate demand, and this means decreasing government spending and or raising taxes. Again, the idea being if you lower G and you raise taxes, which will give people less money to consume, so we lower C, and then that Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX equation will be lower, and that will reduce our aggregate demand. But again, there are some side effects associated with this. One of the possible side effects is, again, this policy is very politically unpopular, and so will rarely be used when necessary. Right? Remember that we have used expansionary fiscal policy in just about every year since 1965. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have been in a recession every year since 1965. Right? Remember, we have only run 5 budget surpluses, right, and are associated with that restrictive fiscal policy, once in 1969, and then 4 years under Clinton from 1998 through 2001. Right, those are the only years that we have actually had a budget surplus, indicating the use of maybe restrictive fiscal policy there. Right, so again, it's not a very popular policy to use. When you raise people's taxes and you reduce the spending or the amount of money you're going to give them, you're going to be less likely to get elected, so politicians tend not to use it. Right, so again, when we allow politicians to choose what kind of policy that they want to use, they're mostly going to focus on that expansionary fiscal policy and not use this restrictive fiscal policy, even when it's called for. Right. Once again, if timed incorrectly, it could lead to recessions and less economic stability, right? So if we use restrictive policy when we're in an expansion, then that will help calm the economy down from an expansion. But if the economy is already moving towards its full employment level, or if it's already started to dip into a recession and this restrictive policy actually takes hold or impacts the economy during that recession, it's going to make that recession longer and more severe. So again, we got to time it correctly, and that correct timing can be hard to achieve. Right. Now, if you don't like the idea of using fiscal policy, then the Federal Reserve can use restrictive monetary policy to reduce aggregate demand. Right. Again, this involves reducing the money supply, and there are 4 ways that the Fed conducts this restrictive monetary policy to reduce the money supply. And that is 1, through selling bonds. Right. 2 is raising the discount rate. Again, if they raise that interest rate that they are charging commercial banks for borrowing money, commercial banks will borrow less money, and in borrowing less money, we'll be able to extend fewer loans, so that will help decrease that money supply. They can also raise the reserve requirements, or the amount of money that banks have to keep on hand by law, and that'll give them less money to lend out, which will also help lower the size of that money multiplier and reduce that money supply. They can also pay more interest on the excess reserves deposited at the Fed. That will encourage these commercial banks to deposit more money at the Fed rather than loan it out and send it into the public. Again, another way that they can reduce that money supply. Again, there are some possible side effects to this, one of which is restrictive monetary policy will lead to potential deflation in the long run. Again, in the short run, it's going to reduce employment or increase unemployment, and it will reduce our real output. But in the long run, it's just going to lead to deflation, which can be as harmful as inflation. If you are a seller, you rely on high prices, that deflation could certainly hurt you there. Right? And then once again, you have to time it correctly. If timed incorrectly, it could lead to recessions and less economic stability. So if the economy is already at full employment or is already in a recession, and you use this restrictive monetary policy, then you can make that recession even worse, right? Even longer and more severe, right? So again, going back to that graph of our business cycle, the idea here is that when we are in expansion, then we need to slow the economy down. So again, we can do that with our restrictive fiscal policy. And in that restrictive fiscal policy, again, that's the government spending less and taxing people more. And the idea is that will help slow down the economy. Or we can use that restrictive monetary policy, which involves decreasing the supply of money, and again, helps slow the economy down. Right, or a combination of the two. Usually these are often used, or these are at least often used together, rather than just one or the other. And the idea here is that we want to kind of slow the business cycle fluctuations, right? Make them less extreme. So if we do have an expansion, we want that expansion to be relatively small. And if we do have a contraction, we want that contraction to be relatively small. We want to try to get the economy as close to that trend line as possible. Right, so again, we want to make these fluctuations much smaller, maybe much shorter, right? We want to make sure that we are staying close to that trend line. So that is the idea, and in theory, these ideas make sense. Of course, in practice, because of these side effects, they don't always work out so well. Again, good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes because of these unanticipated secondary effects, right? That's no more true than when it comes to using this fiscal and monetary policy, right? So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get into the historical context of monetary policy throughout history here. Right, so remember that monetary policy suffers from the recognition lag, knowing where the economy is headed in terms of that business cycle, the administrative lag, actually deciding what changes you want to make, and then the impact lag, right, making sure that the time it takes for those changes to make their way through the economy or actually having an impact. Right, that affects both fiscal and monetary policy, making them difficult to time correctly. Right. With that in mind, we talked about how, in chapter 14, we talked about how during the Great Depression, the Fed used restrictive monetary policy both heading into and immediately after the onset of the economic downturn. So again, the economy was really booming during those roaring 20s, right? Unfortunately, the Fed decided that those roaring 20s were a little too roaring and we need to slow the economy down. So they started using some restrictive monetary policy, right, by increasing that discount rate, right? Unfortunately, though, again, the economy was already starting to level out or head into that downturn. So by the time that policy took hold, right, then the economy was already kind of collapsing or into that contraction. And then they continue to use that restrictive monetary policy even after that economic downturn, and causing the length and severity of the Great Depression to be even worse. Right. Remember that the financial crisis of 2008 was largely fueled by the Fed using the prolonged expansionary monetary policy in the form of keeping interest rates low to combat a 2001 economic contraction that was largely caused by the terrorist attacks on September 11th. And unfortunately, that helped fuel the housing bubble by getting people to buy these adjustable rate mortgages at a time when these mortgages were becoming quite toxic due to those lower lending standards. Right, so first of all, the Fed kind of fueled the bubble by keeping those interest rates low even after the economy started to rebound, and then they helped fuel the burst of that bubble by increasing those interest rates in an effort to combat inflation later on. Right. So again, some mistimed policy there could be responsible for at least the onset, if not at least partially the severity of the financial crisis of 2008. As far as what is going on right now, the Fed has been using this expansionary monetary policy throughout the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, right, in an effort to help stimulate the economy, which is again has high unemployment and lower GDP, and kind of headed towards a severe recession as a result of these social distancing measures. Now, will this monetary policy actually keep us from going into a recession? Did the Fed time it correctly? This is all stuff that is currently kind of under debate as we don't know what the future holds. So we'll see what happens. Maybe by the time this class is taught in a year or two into the future, we'll know the effects of this policy. But it's kind of interesting to know that you're in the middle of an experiment here that is being run to see how effective this monetary policy is at keeping the economy out of an economic recession or contraction. All right, so again, we'll see what happens in the future. I don't know what the future is going to hold, but it'll be interesting to find out. And that is it for this discussion section. Go ahead and try to complete the 10th discussion session assignment if you like on your own on iLearn, as long as you're comfortable with the information in this video and in the Chapter 14 lecture videos. As always, just let me know if you have any questions. You can shoot me an email or come visit me during those Zoom office hours, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But until then, it has been a pleasure creating this discussion section videos, and it's been an honor teaching you all this quarter. Take care.